a whisper under the willow, and a truth buried for years. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. I love seeing this community grow. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. Hearing from you makes this journey even more special. Let's start. Market Flaxborough had known quieter mornings, though perhaps none quite so politely perplexing as the one following the annual flower and produce show. By 10:30, the dew had dried from the bunting that still fluttered across the market square, and the smell of trampled chrysanthemums lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of civic pride and mild disappointment. The vicar's dahlias, as everyone knew, had withered at the edges, while Mrs. Dapp's marrow had been whispered about in terms that suggested the employment of chemical persuasion. It was the town clerk, Mr. Eustace Wigg, who first noticed the disturbance. He had been walking his customary loop, a modest circuit from the town hall to the post office and back, when he paused by the ornamental pond at the far end of the municipal gardens. The pond itself, a shallow oval bordered by concrete painted the color of melancholy, had once been the pride of the urban district council. Now it mostly provided a home to algae and the occasional duck of doubtful parentage. This morning, however, the pond offered something new. Under the overhanging branches of the old willow tree, where the water thickened into shadow, there was, unmistakably, a shape. Not a person, as Wigg told himself immediately, but not either the sort of shape one ignored. A bundle, dark, compact, and motionless, snagged against the roots like a forgotten sack. He stood for a moment, adjusting his hat, and looked about. The park was empty, save for a pair of pensioners on a distant bench, both apparently asleep or pretending to be. Wigg cleared his throat, decided that public duty outweighed distaste, and approached the edge of the pond. When, a minute later, he stepped back, pale and uncertain, he did what any sensible municipal official would do. He sought out the constabulary. Sergeant Love was polishing his boots when the call came in, an activity he regarded as central to both personal dignity and police efficiency. He looked up at the desk telephone as though it had insulted him, then answered with the air of a man granting a favor. By 11 o'clock, he and Inspector Purbright were standing beside the willow, looking down into the still water. The bundle had been lifted clear by now. Carefully, with the aid of a rake and the collective nervousness of 3 council workmen. It was, as it turned out, not a sack at all, but a woman's handbag, old, greenish, and unmistakably expensive. The clasp had rusted, and from within came the faint scent of something floral and long since faded. "Well," said Love, with the cautious optimism of one who hopes for the trivial, "it might have just blown in." Purbright, who was crouching by the edge, examined the mud-stained leather without touching it. His expression was mild and unreadable. "Indeed," he murmured, "though I rather think it didn't blow far." He straightened up slowly. "You'd better have Miss Teat register it, and perhaps ask Mrs. Bannister at the draper's whether she recognizes it. She's a sort of clearinghouse for anything in Flaxborough that isn't nailed down." Love nodded and looked back toward the town hall, where a small crowd had begun to form. A discovery of any sort, however mundane, was nourishment for the local appetite. By noon, half the town would have improved upon it. By the time the handbag reached the police station, accompanied by a growing cloud of conjecture, Miss Teat, the inspector's secretary and the unacknowledged governor of the entire administrative process, had already cleared a space for it on her desk. She regarded the object with pursed lips. "Women don't lose handbags like that, Inspector," she said firmly. "Not proper ones. They put them down, yes, in church or on buses, but they don't lose them." Purbright smiled faintly. "An important distinction." "It is," she said, "and you do well to remember it." By afternoon, the handbag had yielded its contents: a compact mirror, a powder puff the color of old ivory, 2 keys on a faded ribbon, and a small address book containing, among other names, that of Mrs. Isabel Creek of Willow House, just beyond the railway line. Purbright spent a long moment looking at the name. He knew Mrs. Creek slightly. Everyone did. A widow of 10 years' standing, given to charitable committees and sherry at 4. The kind of woman who knew precisely what was expected of her and delivered it with crisp punctuality. "Sergeant," said Purbright at last, "I think we'll pay Mrs. Creek a visit. Perhaps she's misplaced her things by the pond." Love hesitated. "And if she hasn't, sir?" Purbright's smile deepened very slightly. "Then," he said, "I imagine she'll tell us something even more interesting." By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love reached Willow House, the air had thickened into the kind of autumn afternoon that seemed designed for secrets. Still, faintly scented with damp leaves, and muffled enough to make each sound deliberate. The gravel drive was tidy but unconvincingly so, as if someone had recently raked it to suggest a calm order they did not quite feel. Mrs. Isabel Creek herself appeared at the door before the inspector could knock. She had that particular alertness of those accustomed to receiving unplanned visitors, and though she smiled, it was the kind of smile that requested an explanation rather than offered a welcome. Her hair was pale and precise, her cardigan immaculate, her eyes faintly impatient. "Inspector Purbright," she said, as if recalling a social duty she had once undertaken and found underwhelming. "And Sergeant Love. How very official. Is something amiss?" Purbright inclined his head with the soft courtesy that always seemed to irritate people in a hurry. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Creek. I hope we haven't disturbed you. A small matter. A handbag was recovered from the ornamental pond in the municipal gardens this morning. It appears to have belonged at one time to you." Mrs. Creek's expression did not flicker, though her fingers moved slightly at her side. "A handbag?" "Yes. Green leather, rather well made. Contained, among other things, an address book with your name and address inside. Perhaps you misplaced it?" She gave a delicate laugh, light but without warmth. "Good heavens, no. I haven't lost a handbag in years. I'm quite sure of that, but, well, I suppose it's possible it was stolen. These days one never knows. Did you find anything else inside?" Purbright studied her with polite attention. "Only the usual contents. A mirror, powder compact, 2 keys on a ribbon. Nothing of monetary value." "Then it must have been taken from me and thrown away," she said briskly. "Children, perhaps. They're dreadful around that park." Purbright smiled. "Indeed, though they usually prefer marbles to handbags." For a moment her composure wavered, not in panic, but in faint irritation at his tone, which was almost playful. "If there's nothing further, Inspector, I really must get back to my arrangements. I'm expecting guests this evening. The Historical Society, you know." He nodded. "Of course. Would you mind if we kept the handbag for the time being? Routine, you understand." "As you wish." When the door closed behind them, Love released a quiet breath. "She didn't seem much troubled, sir." "No," Purbright said thoughtfully, "but she seemed very sure of what she wished to appear." They walked back to the car in silence. The inspector paused once, glancing toward the rear of the house. The garden there was large, uneven, and dominated by the same willow that lent its name to the house. Its branches dipped low, half concealing a narrow footpath that led toward the meadows and, beyond them, the river. He made a small note in his pocketbook and said nothing. By the time they returned to the station, the story had grown wings. According to Miss Teat, who regarded gossip as both a civic duty and a defensive art, the entire town was now aware that a handbag containing certain mysterious items had been discovered under circumstances suggesting foul play. The word murder had been used only twice, she reported, but with sufficient emphasis to guarantee repetition. Purbright listened with mild interest. Did the mayor's wife call yet? Twice, said Miss Teat. She wishes to know whether it's safe to hold the bridge evening at the assembly rooms. Apparently, people are nervous about handbags. Quite right, said Purbright gravely. They can be treacherous. Love returned from the constable's office with a sheaf of notes. We've checked the park attendants, sir. No one saw anyone near the pond last night, though one of them mentioned hearing a car about 10 o'clock. Said it stopped briefly by the main gate, then drove off. That would be unusual at that hour. Yes, sir, especially since the gates are supposed to be locked. Purbright nodded. Supposed to be, yes. He turned to Miss Teat. Would you ring up Mr. Wigg at the town hall, ask whether he still has the spare keys to the park gates? Miss Teat's eyebrows rose. You think someone borrowed them? I think, Purbright replied, that someone might have returned them. Evening fell early, draping the town in its habitual half-light, the lamplight pooling beneath the shop awnings like faint applause. At the station, Purbright sat at his desk, rereading his notes. There was, he reflected, a faint echo in the affair. The handbag, the Willow, Mrs. Creek's calmness. It had the quality of a performance practiced too long. He looked up as Love entered again. Sir, the sergeant said, we've had word from the railway station. Porter found something this afternoon by the left luggage counter. Thought it was rubbish at first, but it's a lady's scarf. Pale blue silk, initials IC embroidered at the corner. Where exactly? Behind the counter, half under a bench. Looks like it slipped there some days ago. Clerk says it wasn't there yesterday. Purbright's eyes narrowed just slightly. Mrs. Isabel Creek again. It would seem she's rather well represented around town. Love looked puzzled. You think she's involved, sir? I think, said Purbright mildly, she's either extremely careless or extremely careful. The difference, in my experience, tends to be illuminating. He rose, stretching slightly, then looked toward the darkened windows. We'll visit the station in the morning. Tonight, let's allow the town to do what it does best. Talk, sir? Precisely. In the morning we shall see what the talk has decided is true, and perhaps what it has almost managed to hide. The inspector smiled faintly, a shadow of humor crossing his eyes as the clock chimed 6. Outside, the willow branches stirred in the faint wind, and somewhere in the half-lit streets of Flaxborough, a story was already being retold, reshaped, and quietly misunderstood, as all good stories are before the truth is ready to speak. Morning brought a bleached sky and a queue of commuters pretending not to mind the draught under the station canopy. Purbright and Love arrived just after 8, when the smell of tea and metal made everything seem useful. The porter, a stooped man called Cragg, produced the pale blue scarf from a drawer with the ceremony of a conjurer returning a rabbit. Found it tucked behind the bench, he said. Could have been there days, though I sweep that corner most afternoons. Purbright examined the initials stitched in a prim hand. I see, he murmured. Did anyone ask after it? Cragg shook his head. Only Mrs. Birtle. She said it looked like something from a catalogue. The station master, Mr. Fells, joined them and produced a log book. There was a motor car idling by the forecourt last night at 10:10, he announced. Driver stayed in his seat. Someone came from the direction of the left luggage, walked past the kiosk, and got in. Then they went off at a sensible speed. Male or female? Love asked. Female. Smallish, Fells said. The sort to make you mind your grammar. Mrs. Creek? Love ventured. Purbright offered a bland smile. Many ladies in Flaxborough inspire grammatical caution, Sergeant. We mustn't narrow the field to syntax. They crossed to the left luggage counter. The clerk admitted that the hatch was unfastened between 10 and 1:30. I was seeing about a parcel, he said. Came back and thought nothing of it. There's nothing missing, far as I can tell. Yet something was added, Purbright observed, indicating the corner where the scarf had been. Back at the police station, Miss Teat had news. Mr. Wiggs sends his compliments and his apologies. The spare keys to the park gates were, until very recently, kept in a tin in his bottom drawer. They are now most likely in the same place. Most likely, Love repeated. They were not there at lunchtime yesterday, Miss Teet said. Mr. Wigg moved them to his household umbrella stand for safety during the flower show weekend. He returned them this morning, having discovered the umbrella stand was not secure. Because his char, Mrs. Buttle, tidied it. Purbright nodded. Ask Mr. Wigg to note anyone who visited his office yesterday afternoon, he said, and please ring Willow house. I should like a word with Mrs. Creek about her scarf. The call produced a pause. I have mislaid no scarf, Mrs. Creek said crisply. I possess two, neither blue. If someone has been parading about with my initials, Inspector, it is without my encouragement. Another lady with the initials IC, perhaps, Purbright said pleasantly. Her exhalation traveled the line. If you have finished with my name, Inspector, do not bandy it. After the receiver clicked, Love looked up from his notebook. She's tightening, sir. Only the laces, Purbright replied. By noon, the town had sorted itself into two opinions. Those who thought Mrs. Creek robbed by idle youths, and those who thought she had thrown something away. The latter view, favored by Mrs. Bannister at the Drapers, arrived with a suggestion that Willow house was not as quiet as it looked after dusk. Purbright's next call was the vicarage, where the Reverend Swithin admitted to seeing a woman walking briskly from the municipal gardens at 10:15. A scarf, yes, he said. Light in color, she wore it like armor. Recognize her. I thought so at the time, but then I thought about Christian charity and decided not to. Prudent, Purbright said. Did she look towards the town hall? Not once, said the vicar, which suggests she had recently looked at it too much. Outside, Love said. That's near enough a description. Near enough to be useful later, Purbright said. They drove by Willow on their return. From within came a flurry of voices. On the footpath, two schoolboys poked at a drowned bottle. Purbright watched the water. At the station, a message awaited them from Mr. Wigg, a list of yesterday's visitors. Among the expected names, councillors, a planning applicant, the librarian, was a neat addition in ink. Mrs. I. Creek, 4:10 p.m., inquiry re. Assembly rooms bookings. Purbright set the slip beside the handbag and the blue scarf, then drew from the bag the two keys on their faded ribbon. Sergeant, he said, take these to Mr. Wigg and ask whether either fits the park gates. Love reached for them, then paused. Should I wear gloves, sir? If it helps you, be careful. It is always as well to appear careful in Flaxborough. People take it as reassurance. Left alone, Purbright traced a fingertip over the ribbon's frayed edge. A woman who disliked being bandied would also dislike fraying. He looked at the clock and, as if to himself, said, 10:10, 10:15. The town ticked in agreement. Sergeant Love returned from the town hall in a state of mild bewilderment, which for him was close to excitement. He placed the two keys on Purbright's desk as though they might explode. Mr. Wigg tested them himself, sir. One's for the south gate of the municipal gardens, and the other, well, that's the odd bit. It's for the tool shed by the pond. He says it hasn't been used since the summer fete. Purbright nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the rain-darkened window. And both keys were attached to Mrs. Creek's ribbon. Yes, sir. Wigg swears he didn't lend them to anyone. Said he'd have remembered because of that business with the fish pond subscription last year. Purbright smiled faintly. Mr. Wigg remembers every subscription, especially those unpaid. He leaned back. So, a handbag in the pond, its keys belonging to the park, and a scarf with her initials turning up at the railway. Mrs. Creek insists none of it is hers, which suggests naturally that it is. Love frowned. Do you think she was in the park that night? I think, Purbright said. She has been in many places where she prefers not to be noticed. He tapped the desk. Fetch me the attendance list from the flower and produce show. Let's see who might have reason to wander near the pond late that evening. While Love went off, Miss Teet entered with a letter tray and a faint air of moral disapproval. A note came for you, Inspector, delivered by hand, rather early this morning before you arrived. Purbright took the envelope. It was plain, unaddressed, sealed with a careful fold. Inside was a single sheet typed, "You are looking in the wrong place. Ask who met under the willow tree after dark. Not who lost something, who found something." There was no signature, only a faint trace of scent. Powder, faintly floral, curiously old-fashioned. Purbright read it twice, then placed it back in the envelope as if it might choose to finish its sentence later. "Another admirer?" Miss Teet asked dryly. "Possibly," Purbright murmured. "Or a cautious participant." Love returned a few minutes later with the attendance register, a long list of names punctuated with flourishes of ink. "About 60 in all, sir. Half the council, most of the Women's Guild, and a few from the Historical Society. Mrs. Creek was there, naturally. She presented the trophy for the best arrangement in a teapot. And there's someone else I noticed, Mr. Gerald Creek." Purbright looked up. "Gerald?" "Yes, sir. Her late husband, I thought, but apparently not so late as all that. Mr. Wiggs says he saw the name on a committee renewal form last month. Lives out near Bracken Hollow, goes by G. Creek, Antiques Restoration." Purbright's expression altered slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening in what passed for interest. "Ah. So Mrs. Creek's widowhood, like many things in Flaxborough, may be largely ceremonial." They drove to Bracken Hollow that afternoon. The lane there was narrow and muddy, lined with hedgerows that seemed to listen. The cottage itself stood apart from the road, partly hidden by unpruned lilac. A sign on the gate read, "Creek and Coas. Restorations of quality." Gerald Creek proved to be a man of the town's quieter margins, thin, middle-aged, and untidily intelligent. He met them in a workshop that smelled of varnish and dust. "My wife sent you, I suppose," he said before introductions were done. "Your wife?" Purbright said mildly. "We understood you were deceased." Creek smiled without humor. "She'd like it that way, no doubt. Easier to explain things." Love blinked. "So you've been separated?" "For years. We agreed to disagree about everything. She kept the house. I kept my patience." He wiped his hands on a cloth. "If she's reported something stolen, it won't be the first time she's misplaced it herself." Purbright studied him. "Tell me, Mr. Creek, where were you on the evening of the flower show?" "Here, I think. Finishing a cabinet for the Historical Society. No reason to be at her end of town." "No reason," Purbright echoed, "but perhaps a habit." Creek looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Only that the park lies between here and Willowdean House. Convenient, perhaps, for a quiet word. Under the willow tree." Creek hesitated, then turned away, pretending to examine a brass hinge. "If someone's been talking," he said finally, "they're mischief makers. I haven't spoken to Isabel in months." Purbright nodded, as if that were both expected and useful. "Quite so. Thank you, Mr. Creek. Should anything come to mind, anything you may have seen or heard, please let us know. Even small things have a way of growing." On the drive back, Love said, "He looked worried enough." "Guilt and worry often shop at the same tailor," Purbright said. "We'll see which suit he's wearing tomorrow." By the time they reached the station, dusk was gathering again. Miss Teet greeted them with the efficiency of a telegram. "A Mrs. Fenn called," she said. "She lives opposite the municipal gardens. Thought she saw a light in the park last night, round 11, near the pond." Purbright's eyes lifted slightly. "Did she say what kind of light?" She wasn't sure. Said it flickered. Could have been a torch or a cigarette. Purbright stood a moment, his gaze distant. the faintest smile returning. "Sergeant, let's pay Mrs. Fenn a call. If there's one thing Flaxborough never misremembers, it's what it sees from behind lace curtains." Love gave a half sigh, half grin. "You think someone went back to the scene?" "Someone," Purbright said, reaching for his coat, "who left something unfinished, and under that willow tree, things have a way of staying damp." Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain again, and the first lamps blinked on along the high street. Somewhere beyond them, near the park's edge, the willow waited, its drooping branches hiding more than just the reflection of passing clouds. Mrs. Fenn lived in a small square house on the edge of the park, the sort that always appeared to be waiting for visitors who never came. She answered the door with a pincushion still strapped to her wrist, and her face arranged into the polite curiosity reserved for official inquiries that were not about taxes. Purbright introduced himself and Sergeant Love, and within moments they were seated in a drawing-room that smelt of starch and boiled potatoes, while Mrs. Fenn, eyes bright with importance, recounted what she had seen. "It was last night, just after the 10 o'clock news," she began. "I was darning socks by the front window, as I often do. I keep the curtain open an inch or two. One must be vigilant these days, and I saw a glimmer in the park. Near the willow, you know. It flickered, went out, then appeared again farther along the path. Like someone moving, but quietly." "Could you see who it was?" Purbright asked. "I could not, Inspector, but I will say this. It wasn't a tall person, and they weren't in a hurry. Moved in that determined sort of way that suggests they'd been there before." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I didn't like to mention it earlier, but I think it was a lady. There was something about the shape, a coat with a belt maybe, but no hat." Purbright nodded. "Did you hear anything? A car, perhaps?" "A motor did pass about 10 minutes later, going toward the railway. But it didn't sound local, not Mr. Wiggs Morris, at least." Love took notes dutifully, while Purbright offered a small bow of thanks and stood. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Fenn. Please let us know if you notice anything further, anything at all, even if it seems trivial." As they stepped outside, Love said, "She's quite certain, isn't she? Another sighting around the willow." "Yes," Purbright replied, "and her timing agrees with that note left for me this morning." "You think it's connected?" "I think coincidence rarely walks alone." The inspector's car rolled quietly down the high street, the lamps now glowing faintly against the mist. Purbright was silent, his hands steady on the wheel. Love, sensing a pattern just beyond his reach, ventured, if Mrs. Creek did go back there, what would she be looking for? She already had her handbag found, her scarf discovered. What else could be left? Purbright's eyes flicked toward him, mild as ever. Something she hadn't meant to lose. They stopped at the park gates. The padlock on the south side hung open. Purbright examined it with his torch. It bore faint scratches, as though a key had been turned hastily. The grass beyond was slick, glistening faintly. He motioned for Love to follow. Near the pond, the willow trailed its long fingers into the water. The air was heavy, still. Somewhere a bird shifted, and a ripple broke the surface. Purbright's light caught a small indentation near the path, a heel mark sharp in the damp earth. A few inches away, a faint depression where a toe had slipped. "She came here," he said softly. "Twice, at least." Love peered down. "To do what, sir?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the willow trunk. Something pale glinted half-buried at the roots. He crouched, brushing away a few damp leaves. It was a fragment of paper, stiffened by moisture, torn along one side. On it, in a neat, typed hand, were the words, "Inventory of sale items, W House, June 19th. He held it up to the torchlight. "W House," he murmured. "Willow Dean House. Or something else beginning with W." Love looked puzzled. "A sale? Like an auction?" "Possibly," Purbright said. though it seems a curious place to store auction lists. He folded the fragment carefully into his notebook. The sound of the water lapping beneath the willow seemed to grow louder, as though something below stirred in. Irritation. "Sergeant," he said, "we'll have the pond dragged tomorrow morning, just to satisfy my sense of tidiness." Love looked alarmed. "You think there's something down there?" Purbright smiled faintly. "If there isn't, I shall have wasted only a morning. But if there is, we may have found what Mrs. Creek came back for." They left the park quietly, locking the gate behind them. By the time they reached the station again, the town was asleep, its windows dark and decent. Miss Teet had gone home, leaving the desk tidy and a note reminding the inspector about the Women's Guild raffle. Purbright sat for a while, listening to the hum of the electric clock. Then he took out the anonymous letter, the paper fragment from the willow, and the keys from the handbag, arranging them in a slow, deliberate line. 3 small pieces, none complete, each pointing in a direction too polite to name. Love, watching from the doorway, said, "It's odd, sir, how all this started with just a handbag." "Odd," Purbright agreed, "but not unusual. In Flaxborough, most disturbances begin with something a lady prefers not to discuss." He paused, then added, "And end, more often than not, with something a gentleman thought he'd buried." Outside, the church clock struck 11. The willows stirred again in the windless dark, and somewhere beneath its drooping branches, the pond hid its quiet, patient secret a little longer. By the time dawn crept across the tiled roofs of Market Flaxborough, the municipal park had acquired a quiet air of scandal. 2 constables and a council gardener stood at the pond's edge, boots sinking into mud, while a man in waders maneuvered a rake through the sluggish water. Inspector Purbright watched from the path, hands loosely clasped behind his back, his breath rising faintly in the chill air. Sergeant Love, less comfortable with damp mornings, hovered nearby and tried to look competent. After half an hour of careful dredging, the rake caught on something solid. The gardener tugged, grunted, and lifted clear a sodden parcel wrapped in brown cloth. The constable bent to help, then stopped abruptly. From one corner protruded a pale shape that was unmistakably the edge of a human hand. Love's sharp intake of breath broke the silence. Purbright merely sighed, a sound more of inevitability than shock. "Very well," he said quietly. "Let's see who our early riser has been keeping company." The bundle was lifted onto the grass and unwrapped with slow precision. Beneath the folds of fabric lay the body of a man, middle-aged, finely dressed, the pallor of his face at odds with the mud that streaked his collar. A thin wound marked the side of his head, not deep but deliberate. There was no wallet, no watch, nothing by which to name him, yet Purbright already suspected he did not need them. He had seen that angular jaw before, though never so still. "It's Gerald Creek, Love," said after a moment, his voice uncertain. "The antique restorer has to be." Purbright nodded slightly. "Yes, death has a way of confirming identities even better than birth certificates." The body was taken away discreetly, but Flaxborough discretion was a porous thing. By mid-morning, half the town had heard that something unpleasant had been found near the willow. By lunchtime, Mrs. Bannister was telling customers that the inspector had discovered an affair gone tragic, while Mr. Wigg was already considering the most tactful phrasing for the council minutes. In the station office, Purbright sat at his desk, fingers resting lightly on the fragment of paper marked Inventory of Sale Items, W. House, June 19th. Miss Teet, pale with controlled excitement, had already typed up the initial report. "Dr. Hodge estimates time of death at about 48 hours, she said. "That would place it late on Monday night, just after the flower show, Inspector." Purbright nodded. "Consistent with our timeline." Love, standing by the window, said, "So he wasn't lying when he told us he hadn't spoken to Mrs. Creek in months. He'd already done his last talking." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. Or perhaps the talking didn't go as planned. He looked toward Miss Teet. Ask Mrs. Creek to come in this afternoon, please, as a matter of identification, naturally. When Mrs. Creek arrived, she was as composed as ever, her clothing impeccable, her gloves cream against the dark of her coat. She stood before the inspector's desk with the faint impatience of one inconvenienced by other people's drama. "I understand you have something unpleasant to show me," she said. Purbright regarded her for a long moment. "Not to show you, Mrs. Creek. Only to confirm. Your husband has been found dead in the municipal pond." For a second, barely a breath, something flickered behind her eyes. Then it vanished. "My husband," she repeated. "Surely you mean my former husband." "Indeed," Purbright said mildly. "Though as the law stands, the term still applies." She drew herself up. "If this is your idea of humor, Inspector, it is misplaced. I have not seen Gerald in months. We were estranged." "So he told us," Purbright replied. "Yet it seems he was closer to you this week than either of you wished." Her composure tightened, becoming brittle. "Are you suggesting I had anything to do with his death?" "I'm suggesting," Purbright said gently, "that your handbag contained the keys to the park gates and the shed by the pond. I'm also suggesting that someone met your husband there after dark on Monday night." She hesitated, her gloved hands clasping and unclasping. "I lent those keys to a friend, Mrs. Liddon from the Historical Society. She wished to take photographs of the gardens." Purbright's eyes softened as though amused by a child's fib. "An admirable purpose, though not at 10 o'clock at night, and not under the willow." Mrs. Creek's face colored faintly. "If you intend to accuse me, Inspector, I shall require a solicitor." "Not at all," Purbright said. "I intend only to understand. There was an inventory sheet, you see, found at the same spot. It mentioned Willowdene House. Curious, that. I thought perhaps your husband might have been arranging a sale of property. Your property, perhaps?" Her silence was answer enough. Purbright leaned forward slightly, his tone still courteous, but edged with steel. "Was it you who discovered that your husband had been removing items from the house? Small valuables, ornaments, a painting or two. It would explain your meeting in the park, a discreet setting for an indelicate discussion." She looked away, her voice low. "He was taking what didn't belong to him. He'd already sold half of what we bought together. I only wanted him to return what was mine." "And did he?" Her eyes flicked toward him. "No, he laughed." Purbright waited, letting the silence deepen. "And then?" "I left him there," she said quickly. "Alive, I swear it." The inspector's gaze remained steady. "I believe you did, but someone else didn't." When she was gone, Love said, "You think there was another person there?" Purbright rose and went to the window, looking out across the square. "Someone who stood to gain from silence. The inventory mentions June 19th, but the show was in August. That suggests planning, not passion. Mr. Creek was selling more than curiosities. Perhaps something that shouldn't have been for sale at all." He turned, the faintest trace of a smile appearing. "Tomorrow we'll visit the Historical Society. I believe they've been missing a few antiques recently, and perhaps one of them has been keeping a rather heavy secret beneath the willow." The Flaxborough Historical Society occupied 2 rooms above the library, where the smell of dust and boiled tea lived in comfortable partnership. Purbright and Love climbed the narrow stairs to find Mrs. Liddon, a tall, earnest woman with iron-grey hair, presiding over a row of glass display cases as if guarding the nation's crown jewels. "Inspector Purbright," she said, clasping her hands. "How unexpected. Has someone been interfering with the exhibits again? We had trouble once with a boy who mistook the Roman coins for toffee." Purbright smiled faintly. "No, nothing of that nature. I wanted to ask about a gentleman named Gerald Creek. I understand he did some work for your society." Mrs. Liddon's lips pursed into a shape that suggested disapproval was not new to her. He restored several pieces last year, competent enough with wood, but not always with invoices. We engaged him to refurbish a Georgian writing desk, which later went missing. He claimed it was in transit. It never reappeared. Did Mrs. Creek ever visit during that time? She attended 1 or 2 committee evenings, brought along those ghastly biscuits with pink icing. A woman of means, but... She hesitated, lowering her voice. Rather too conscious of it. One always felt she considered herself our patroness rather than a member. Did she ever express interest in the society's property? Oh, frequently. She offered to store certain items safely at Willow House while the storeroom was repainted. The offer was declined. I remember thinking Mr. Creek looked particularly uneasy at the suggestion. Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. And recently, has anyone else handled society articles? Say, for sale or valuation? Mrs. Liddon frowned, consulting a ledger. Only Mr. Wigg from the council. He borrowed the catalogues for insurance purposes, but now that you mention it, he returned them missing 1 page, the section on donated silver. He said it had come loose. I've yet to find it. As they left the building, Love said, "So both the Wiggs and the Creeks have their fingers in the same pie. What do you think was being sold, sir? Silver, perhaps, or something easier to melt down, reputation." They walked back toward the square, the afternoon dull and windless. At the station, Miss Teet was waiting with news that had the tone of an announcement rather than a report. "Inspector, a letter's arrived for you. Typewritten again, no return address." Purbright opened it at his desk. The words were brief, the type the same uneven ribbon as before. He took what wasn't his. She saw to it, but she wasn't alone. The man from the town hall knows. Love read over his shoulder. "That would be Mr. Wigg, sir." "Yes," Purbright said quietly. "He does seem to be acquiring new interests in civic matters." They went to the town hall as the day faded, finding Wigg at his desk, sleeves rolled and spectacles low on his nose. He greeted them with exaggerated politeness. "Ah, Inspector, Sergeant. Still busy with that unfortunate business in the park, I imagine. Shocking, really. But if I may say, not entirely surprising. Mr. Creek had a reputation for, shall we say, enterprise." Purbright seated himself opposite, calm and patient. "Enterprise is an admirable quality, Mr. Wigg, provided it stays within its boundaries. Tell me, did you know of any arrangements between Mr. Creek and the Historical Society?" Wigg blinked. "I handled a few invoices. The council occasionally approves small restoration grants. And an inventory, perhaps, one that mentioned Willow House?" Wigg hesitated. "There was such a document, yes. Routine, I assure you. Mrs. Creek was to hold certain items temporarily, valuables, while repairs were carried out in the museum storeroom. Entirely proper. Yet the society has no record of authorizing it," Purbright said mildly. Wigg dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. "There may have been an oversight. Mr. Creek assured me the society would benefit from a discreet sale of duplicates. You know how these things are. Fundraising, civic improvements. And the profits?" Wigg's hand faltered. "A modest commission for expenses." Purbright regarded him kindly. "Then I imagine Mr. Creek's death has been a most inconvenient interruption to your accounting." Wigg's complexion turned the color of old putty. "I had nothing to do with that, Inspector. Nothing. We were to meet that evening, yes, in the park," he insisted. "But he never came. I waited by the gates for 10 minutes, then I left. Ask anyone." "I will," Purbright said. "Though I doubt anyone saw you waiting. The town prefers its scandals heard second-hand." When they returned to the station, Love exhaled heavily. "So Wigg admits he arranged a sale through Creek. If Mrs. Creek found out, that could explain the quarrel." "Indeed," Purbright said, taking off his coat. "But not the blow to the head. That required less conversation and more conviction." He walked to the window, watching as the last light fell over the park's distant outline. Someone else was there, Sergeant. Someone who knew about the sale, perhaps feared exposure. Wig may have had the motive, but not the temperament. No, the killing was tidy, practical, and the attempt to hide the body rather more thorough than Wig could manage without smudging his cuffs. Love looked uneasy. Then who, sir? Purbright smiled faintly, turning back. We'll let Flaxborough tell us. It's been whispering all day. Tomorrow we shall listen carefully, and perhaps before the week's end, someone will mention just a little too much about what lies beneath that willow. Morning broke with a sort of dull, indecisive light that made Flaxborough look both respectable and faintly guilty. The town had taken to speaking of the business under the willow with a careful relish, lowering its voice while leaning in closer. Purbright had long understood that gossip in Flaxborough was less a pastime than a civic institution. It needed feeding, but in small, precise doses. At the police station, Miss Teat was already at her desk, typing as briskly as if the typewriter were personally responsible for the murder. She looked up when Purbright entered. "You were right about the whispers, Inspector. The postmistress overheard Mrs. Liddon say that Mr. Wig has been sitting very quietly in his office, which in this town is as good as a confession." Purbright smiled. "The day Mr. Wig sits noisily, we'll know civilization has collapsed." Sergeant Love arrived moments later, bearing the morning paper. "The Gazette's printed a piece on the discovery, sir. They're calling it the Willow Mystery. Front page, too." He laid it down, the headline proclaiming "Local Businessman Found Dead in Park Pond. Police Probe, Possible Connection to Council Affairs." Purbright read the article without expression. "A commendably vague report. Mr. Blenkinsop must be losing his touch." Love frowned. "There's one part I don't like. Says sources close to the investigation claimed that a woman was seen near the park that night. That'll stir them up." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and it will be useful. When a town this small begins to imagine guilt, it often guesses nearer the mark than it knows." By mid-morning, Mrs. Creek had telephoned, her tone brittle, indignant, and not without fear. "Inspector, I cannot have my name bandied about in the newspapers. It's intolerable. I insist you make a statement clearing me of all involvement." "I would be delighted to, Mrs. Creek," Purbright replied gently, "once the investigation allows me to do so, without lying." The silence on the line lasted just long enough for him to hear her breathing, quick and shallow, before the receiver went down sharply. Afterwards, he turned to Love. "We'll visit Mr. Wig again. I suspect his nerves may have loosened overnight." They found the town clerk pale and perspiring, a cup of cold tea untouched beside a pile of correspondence. He rose as they entered, his smile trembling. "Inspector, I've been thinking, I remembered something from that evening. Might be relevant." Purbright inclined his head. "Do go on." "It was after I left the park. I took the long way home, through the lane by the allotments. There was a car there, a small black Austin parked oddly. Lights off. I heard voices, low at first, then one rather sharp. Female. Couldn't make out words. I hurried on, of course. Didn't wish to intrude." "Could you recognize the voice?" Wig dabbed at his forehead again. "No, but, well, it sounded familiar. Educated, if you know what I mean. Not one of the market women." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "You did not mention this before." "I didn't think it mattered, and frankly, Inspector, I was afraid it might be misconstrued." "Many things are," Purbright said gently. "But sometimes not as much as one hopes." Back at the station, Love said, "So there was another person there. A woman. Could be Mrs. Creek after all. Or someone she confided in," Purbright mused. "Someone who believed themselves invisible." He stood by the window again, watching the drizzle creep down the glass. "Send Constable Harrow to the local garages. Ask who services a small black Austin. There aren't many about, and check who bought petrol late Monday evening. Love hesitated. You think that car's connected to the killing? I think, Purbright said, that it belonged to someone who didn't wish to walk home in muddy shoes. By early afternoon, Harrow returned with a note. A black Austin registered to Mrs. Edna Bannister, draper and noted gossip, who claimed it had been borrowed that night by her cousin, Miss Myrtle Liddon of the Historical Society. Purbright's expression did not change, though his eyes sharpened. Miss Liddon, again. How obliging of her to appear twice in the same story. Love whistled softly. So she took the car, met Creek, maybe Wig, down at the pond. But why? She hardly seems the type for skullduggery. No, Purbright agreed, but she's the type for moral indignation, and that, Sergeant, can be far more dangerous. They found Miss Liddon at home, ironing papers beneath a flowered teapot cozy. She greeted them with nervous civility. I suppose you've come about that poor man. Shocking business. I was quite unwell when I heard. Purbright nodded sympathetically. I imagine so. It's never pleasant when one's acquaintances turn up unexpectedly in ponds. Might we sit? She hesitated, then motioned to 2 chairs. Of course. He sat carefully. We've learned that you borrowed Mrs. Bannister's car on Monday evening. You didn't mention it when we saw you at the society yesterday. Her hands fluttered to her lap. Yes, I borrowed it. Only for an hour. I had some papers to deliver to Mr. Creek. Historical Society matters. I left them at his workshop. He wasn't there. Ah, Purbright said. You went to his workshop, but the car was seen by the park around the same time. I must have stopped for air, she said too quickly. It was a heavy night. Purbright regarded her gently. And after stopping, did you happen to hear voices? A quarrel, perhaps? She looked down, twisting her handkerchief. He was shouting at someone. A woman, I couldn't see who. I drove away. Then why, Purbright asked softly, did you return later? The park gates were opened again about 11. Her eyes widened. How could you? The padlock, Miss Liddon. It tells its own story. You see, what puzzles me is why you would risk being seen twice. Once might be curiosity. Twice suggests concern. She swallowed, color rising to her cheeks. I went back to find him. I thought perhaps she'd... She stopped. She... Miss Liddon pressed her lips together. Mrs. Creek, she whispered. I followed them. I couldn't bear it. He'd deceived her, and then me. He'd promised to marry me once her divorce was through, but he was selling the society's property, using me to arrange it. I thought she might expose him. I only wanted to stop them both making fools of themselves. Purbright's tone remained calm. And when you found him? Her face went white. He was already lying by the pond. I tried to lift him. He didn't move. I panicked. I pushed him in, thinking it might look like an accident. I didn't kill him, Inspector. I swear I didn't. Purbright's expression did not change. No, Miss Liddon, I rather think you didn't. But someone took advantage of your panic to make sure the truth stayed where it belonged. Underwater. He stood, smoothing his coat. For now, you'll remain here. Sergeant Love will take your statement, and if you recall precisely who might have known of your meeting that night, you'll save us all another damp morning by the pond. As he stepped out into the fading light, Purbright paused, his gaze turning once more toward the park. The Willow's silhouette loomed over the rooftops, bending like a listener too polite to interrupt. The inspector buttoned his coat, his expression thoughtful and oddly serene. Flaxborough, he murmured to himself, never disappoints in its talent for respectable deceit. The next morning was raw and damp, with a fine mist drifting in from the river and flattening the town's usual noises into something subdued and secretive. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station early, his coat shoulders glistening faintly, and found Miss Teat already sorting through correspondence with the solemnity of a coroner. She greeted him with a brief nod and placed a sheet of paper on his desk. "Miss Liddon's statement, Inspector. She barely slept, but I must say she's produced a very thorough confession of panic." Purbright smiled faintly. "A thorough confession of panic is almost a contradiction, Miss Teet. Panic tends to produce rather shorter documents." "She's meticulous, even in remorse," Miss Teet replied. "She insists she didn't strike Mr. Creek, and I'm inclined to believe her. She was much too busy feeling aggrieved." "Quite so," said Purbright, reading through the pages. The statement was orderly, almost prim. Miss Liddon admitted to jealousy, following the couple, discovering the body, and, out of fear, rolling it into the pond. Her narrative ended there, neat as a drawer of folded linen. It lacked the rough edge of murder. When Love entered, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea, Purbright handed him the file. "Read this, Sergeant. It's an admirable piece of fiction, written under oath." Love skimmed it quickly, frowning. "You don't think she did it, then?" "Oh, she did something," Purbright said mildly. "But killing isn't in her grammar. It's too untidy." He sipped his tea. "However, she's useful. Whoever actually killed Mr. Creek knew she'd been there and relied upon her fear to keep things muddled." Love leaned against the desk. "So, we're looking for someone who knew about the meeting, knew she'd panic, and had reason to finish what started under that willow." "Precisely," Purbright said. "And such a person must have been close enough to both Creeks to know their affairs. Perhaps literally." He took his hat from the peg. "We'll pay Mrs. Creek another call. I'd like to see how she behaves now that jealousy has been removed as a possible disguise for guilt." Willowdean House looked paler than before, its windows curtained as though observing propriety. Mrs. Creek met them in the drawing room, her composure trimmed to a fine edge. There was colour in her cheeks this morning, but it looked painted on by defiance. "Inspector," she said coolly, "I hope this is your final visit. I have endured quite enough innuendo for 1 week." "I quite understand," said Purbright. "Unfortunately, we're still untangling who, besides yourself, had the misfortune of loving or loathing your late husband." "Miss Liddon," she said at once, her tone brittle. "She was obsessed with him. I told Gerald she was unstable. He found her useful for errands, nothing more." "Indeed. Yet she followed you that evening." Her eyes flicked toward him, wary. "She said that?" "Among other things," Purbright replied softly. "She also said she saw you quarrel." Loudly. Mrs. Creek's fingers tightened on the back of a chair. "He had deceived me for years, Inspector. I went there to demand a confession, not to kill him. I left while he was still shouting." Purbright inclined his head. "Then you'll be pleased to know Miss Liddon found him silent." She looked away, her throat tightening. "I won't cry for him if that's what you expect. Gerald was cruel in small ways, and cruelty accumulates. Still, murder—" She shivered. "That was beyond me." "I rather think it was beyond you, yes," Purbright said gently, "but not beyond someone else you trusted." Her gaze snapped back. "Trusted? Who?" "Mr. Wigg," Purbright said simply. Colour drained from her face. "Wigg? That pompous little man? What possible reason?" "He was your ally in the inventory scheme," Purbright said. "You signed the authorization forms, didn't you? Wigg handled the paperwork, Creek arranged the sale. But then Creek became greedy. He planned to cut you both out, sell the items privately, and disappear. Wigg discovered this, perhaps through you, perhaps by his own snooping. Either way, he met Creek that night, intending to salvage what he could. When talk failed, he panicked. A single blow, enough to silence a scandal that would have ruined more than one civic career." Mrs. Creek stared at him, disbelief fighting comprehension. "But he's harmless," Purbright smiled sadly. "Few men who sign forms for a living are truly harmless, madam. They merely prefer ink to fingerprints." Back at the station, Love said quietly, "You think she's telling the truth?" I think she's telling more than she means to, Purbright replied. Fear often makes people generous with detail. Now we need something solid to bring Mr. Wig back into our confidence. By mid-afternoon, they had it. A constable from the evidence room entered, holding a small packet wrapped in cloth. Found this in the lining of Mr. Creek's jacket, sir. Missed it yesterday, tucked behind the seam. Purbright unwrapped it, carefully. Inside was a folded receipt from a pawnbroker in Boston, dated the day before the murder. The item pledged, silver snuff box, engraved, "To the Society, in gratitude." The signature below read, E. Wig. Purbright's expression barely changed, though his eyes grew faintly bright. Ah, he said softly. The town hall's own contribution to culture. Love grinned grimly. That'll do it, sir. Almost, Purbright said. Before we confront him, I should like to give him the chance to tell the truth without knowing we already possess it. That way we'll hear something far more interesting. When evening came, they found Wig again at his desk, the curtains drawn, though it was barely dark. He started at the sight of them, his smile slipping like a mask caught in the rain. Inspector, Sergeant. So late? Purbright closed the door gently. A small matter, Mr. Wig. About the park that night. You said you left after 10 minutes, yet someone heard a motor start around 11. Would that have been yours, perhaps? Wig's hands twitched. Impossible. I was home by then. Then perhaps your conscience has a car of its own, Purbright said mildly. Because, you see, it was heard again near the railway station not long after. And near the Willow we found something rather more solid than hearsay, your signature on a pawnbroker's receipt. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the office clock. Then Wig sagged back into his chair. He was going to ruin us all, he whispered. I only meant to frighten him. He laughed, said he'd send everything to the Gazette. I struck out. I didn't mean... Purbright watched him kindly, almost sorrowfully. Few ever do, Mr. Wig. Yet somehow they always manage. As the sergeant took the broken clock away, the inspector looked down at the desk, at the tidy rows of council papers. Bureaucracy and murder, he thought, were not such distant cousins. One killed the spirit daily, the other simply chose the quicker route. He put on his hat and stepped out into the night. The Willow stood dark against the moonlight now, still and secretive as ever. But Purbright, with quiet finality, felt the town settle around him once more, its scandals folded away, its respectability restored, at least until the next polite disturbance whispered its way through Flaxborough. The following day carried that peculiar quiet which settles over a town after scandal has momentarily exhausted itself. Market Flaxborough, having dined well on rumour, now turned to a more genteel digestion of facts, each citizen privately congratulating themselves on having suspected exactly the right person all along. The Gazette printed a cautious notice of developments in the Willowdene matter, carefully omitting names but hinting heavily at official involvement. In the High Street, this was taken as proof that Mr. Wig had been led away in handcuffs, that Mrs. Creek had fainted into a policeman's arms, and that the willow tree itself was due for removal in the interest of decency. At the police station, Purbright sat reviewing the final statements. The confession was tidy, plausible, and, he suspected, not entirely complete. Wig had admitted to striking Creek in a moment of panic, claiming the blow had been meant only to silence a threat, not to kill. His tears, genuine enough, had persuaded even Love of the man's guilt. Yet Purbright found himself oddly unsatisfied, as though the case had concluded too smoothly, like a book with one page quietly torn away. Miss Teat interrupted his thoughts with her customary briskness. The mayor is asking if you'll attend this evening's emergency meeting of the council. They're anxious about appearances. Appearances, Purbright murmured, are the lifeblood of local government. Tell the mayor I'll attend, though I may arrive late. I'd like a word with Mrs. Creek first, She raised an eyebrow. Surely she's suffered enough social inconvenience for 1 week. Indeed, he said, but I'm afraid I suffer from a similar affliction, unfinished curiosity. He found Mrs. Creek in the conservatory, trimming an already immaculate fern. The morning light filtered through the glass, making her seem paler, almost transparent. She received him with weary civility. "Inspector, I suppose you've come to tell me it's over." "For the town, yes," Purbright said gently. "For you, perhaps not entirely." Her eyes flicked to him, wary. "You have your murderer. Mr. Wigg has confessed. Surely that satisfies even you." "Confession," Purbright said, "is a form of convenience, not certainty. Mr. Wigg admitted to striking your husband, but only after a quarrel that began elsewhere. What troubles me is that the quarrel itself appears to have been provoked. Deliberately. I don't understand. Gerald Creek arranged that meeting, true, but Wigg went armed with more than anger. He believed he was catching your husband in the act of betrayal. Someone told him as much." She turned away, her hands gripping the shears. "And you think that someone was me?" "I think," Purbright said, "that a woman in your position, humiliated, cornered, might have found it convenient to let 2 dishonest men destroy each other. A quiet word here, a suggestion there. Nothing criminal, perhaps, only catalytic." Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn. "You make me sound very calculating, Inspector." "Not calculating," he said softly. "Just careful. It's the same instinct that keeps a house so spotless one might almost believe nothing ever happens inside it." At that, she faced him. "Do you intend to charge me with something?" "No," Purbright said. "You've broken no law, but you might one day wish to speak less truthfully to yourself." Her voice trembled slightly. "He was cruel to me, Inspector. Not in the ways people see, but in the small ones, mockery, neglect. I wanted him punished, yes, but not like this." Purbright inclined his head. "Punishment, Mrs. Creek, rarely stays within its intended boundaries." He left her standing by the window, her reflection blurred by the fern leaves, and returned to the station just as Sergeant Love was locking up the files. "All settled then, sir?" "Almost," Purbright said. "You might say the truth has been filed under miscellaneous." Love looked puzzled. "You don't think Wigg was the only guilty one?" "Oh, he's guilty enough," Purbright said mildly. "But he was nudged in the right direction. Our Mrs. Creek is far too shrewd to risk her own hands, but not too kind to let someone else dirty theirs for her." Love frowned. "You mean she set him up?" Purbright shook his head gently. "No, Sergeant. She merely allowed nature to run its course. In Flaxborough, that's often all the planning one needs." That evening, Purbright attended the council meeting as promised. It was held in the assembly room, its faint smell of floor polish and self-importance unchanged since the Boer War. The councillors rose when he entered, each with a face of solemn innocence. The mayor, a man whose waistcoat did most of the speaking for him, cleared his throat. "Inspector, we should like to commend the police for their swift and discreet handling of this distressing affair. It is a great relief to the town that the matter has been resolved." Purbright smiled. "I'm delighted you find it so, Mr. Mayor, though I would advise against describing Flaxborough as resolved. It tends to take that as a challenge." A few polite chuckles followed, and the meeting turned to routine matters. Flower beds, lamp posts, the Christmas bazaar. Purbright listened, outwardly attentive, his mind elsewhere. He thought of the willow tree bending over the pond, of Mrs. Creek's steady hands, of Wigg's trembling ones. The story fitted together, but like an old map, its borders overlapped more than they joined. When the meeting adjourned, he stepped outside into the mild evening. The air carried the faint scent of wet leaves and coal smoke. Down the street, shop windows glowed with domestic light, and somewhere a piano played a waltz, just slow enough to sound regretful. Love joined him a few minutes later. "Quiet night, sir. Hard to believe it's only been a week since it all started." Flaxborough recovers quickly, Purbright said. It believes decency can be restored by silence. Do you think Mrs. Creek will ever tell the truth? Purbright smiled faintly. She already has, Sergeant. Only not aloud. They walked on together through the square, their steps echoing on the wet cobbles. The town lay peaceful, prim and faintly watchful, as though waiting for its inspector to turn his back, before beginning some new, small deceit. And Purbright, patient as ever, would be there when it did, listening to the murmurs beneath the quiet, waiting for the next secret to drift up like mist from the pond beneath the willow. The following morning was clear and windless, the kind of autumn day that tried to look innocent after too much mischief. In the municipal gardens, the willow hung motionless, its long branches reflected perfectly in the pond's thin mirror of water. The council had already sent word that it wished the area fenced off, but Inspector Purbright had asked for a day's delay. It's always best, he had told Miss Teat, to let a place settle before we tidy it away. He walked there now, alone, the gravel soft beneath his steps. A few ducks idled at the edge, indifferent to tragedy. From the path, he could see where the grass had grown back over the constable's boot marks. The scene looked ordinary again, almost as though nothing had ever happened. That, Purbright reflected, was the secret power of small towns. Their capacity to absorb anything, crime, scandal, even remorse, without ever truly changing shape. He stood under the willow and lit his pipe. The smoke rose lazily through the damp air. Behind him he heard familiar footsteps and turned as Sergeant Love approached, hat slightly askew. "Morning, sir," Love said. "You wanted to see it once more?" "Merely to make sure it's as peaceful as it looks," Purbright replied. "Appearances, you know." Love nodded. "Mrs. Creek's leaving town. I passed her maid at the station. Said she's going to stay with a sister in Bath." "I thought she might," said Purbright. "A town this size is poor soil for regeneration once gossip takes root." "Funny thing," Love continued. "She asked after you, said you'd been kind." Purbright smiled faintly. "Kindness, Sergeant, is often a matter of tone rather than intention." They stood for a while, watching the surface of the pond ripple where a duck dabbled. "So, it's finished then," Love said finally. "Wig charged, Miss Liddon released, Mrs. Creek gone." "Case closed." "Closed," Purbright repeated softly, "is such an optimistic word." He drew on his pipe and exhaled slowly. "You see, there's one detail that still won't rest quietly. The blow that killed Creek. Too clean, too deliberate for panic. Wig was a man of papers and pencils, not precision, and he confessed far too quickly, before I'd even shown him the receipt, as if he'd rehearsed it." Love looked uneasy. "Then who?" "Miss Teat telephoned me late last night," Purbright went on. "She'd been sorting the correspondence we took from Wig's desk. Among it was a half-written note addressed to Mrs. Creek. It began, 'You need not worry, it is done.' No mention of Creek's name, of course, but dated the morning after the murder. She received it, I imagine, before. I visited her the first time, and she said nothing." Love frowned. So she knew Wig had killed him. Possibly. Or perhaps she'd arranged that assurance herself. You see, Wig adored her, hopelessly, pathetically. She had only to look stricken and he would have done anything to protect her, even confess. Love's eyes widened. Then she really... Purbright shook his head gently. "No proof, and none ever will be. But imagine it. A clever woman wronged by two men, the husband who mocked her and the clerk who served him. One word to the weaker man, one tremor of fear or gratitude, and she turns his devotion into a weapon. He removes the obstacle, believing it gallantry. She lets him hang, believing it justice." Love was silent for a long moment. "You won't say anything?" "To whom?" Purbright said lightly. "The law requires evidence, not intuition. Besides, she's already punished herself more thoroughly than any court could." She'll carry that tidy, unspoken truth around her like a handbag. Never lost, never found. A breeze stirred the willow branches then, brushing the inspector's shoulder as if in quiet acknowledgement. He looked down at the water once more, where the reflection shivered, blurred, and reformed into calm. "Strange," Love murmured, "how peaceful it all looks now." "Yes," Purbright said. "That's Flaxborough for you. Beneath its tidiness, something always stirs, but it never quite breaks the surface." He turned back toward the path, adjusting his hat, and began walking toward the gate. Love followed, glancing once more over his shoulder at the willow, its graceful droop, its patient silence, its secrets buried as neatly as ever. Behind them, the ripples faded and the pond returned to stillness, reflecting only the sky.